Good evening, friends. Welcome to another 12-step story to help you fall asleep. Relax, take a breath, and listen to recovery.
David stands in his corner office, steam rising from his coffee mug as he gazes out at the city below, a city dotted with his creations. There's the Meridian Medical Center, its clean lines cutting elegantly against the gray sky. The Harbor View Apartments, where light filters through carefully calculated window placements. The downtown transit hub, where thousands of people move through spaces he designed, never knowing his name, but living briefly within his vision. David's office reflects the man himself, everything in its place, every surface clean and purposeful. His drafting table sits at a precise 45-degree angle to catch the best northern light. His pencils are arranged by hardness, his rulers nested by size. Even his coffee mug has intention behind it. A simple white ceramic piece with bold black letters reading "Master of My Domain." A gift from his team after the Riverside Plaza project came in 3 weeks ahead of schedule and under budget. David had built his entire life around control. In his world, every line had to be perfect, every calculation precise, every variable accounted for. It's what made him brilliant at his job. It's also what made his relationship with alcohol so terrifyingly confusing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning, when David's systems still worked, when his blueprints for living seemed as solid as the foundations of his buildings. 3 years ago, David's life ran like clockwork. No, more precisely than clockwork. Clockwork could lose a second here or there. David's life ran like the atomic clocks at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Precise, predictable, perfected. His morning routine was a masterpiece of efficiency. 5:45 a.m. Alarm sounds for exactly 30 seconds before the automatic shutoff engages. 2 minutes for the water to reach optimal brewing temperature in his programmable coffee maker, a temperature he had researched extensively and calibrated to 195 degrees Fahrenheit. Shower for precisely 12 minutes while the coffee finished brewing. 7 minutes to dress, selecting from a wardrobe organized by color and season. By 6:15, he was out the door, travel mug in hand, arriving at his office by 6:47. Always 6:47. David applied this same methodical precision to everything. His meal prep happened every Sunday at 2 p.m. Containers lined up like small, transparent buildings, each holding exactly the right portions of protein, vegetables, and complex carbohydrates. His calendar existed in 3 colors: blue for client meetings, green for project work, red for personal appointments. He had calculated the optimal walking routes between his most frequent destinations, accounting for pedestrian traffic patterns and seasonal variations. David's caution around alcohol wasn't arbitrary. His father had been what people politely called a heavy drinker, the kind of man who kept a flask in his desk drawer and whose evening routine involved steadily working through a bottle of whiskey while reviewing architectural plans at the kitchen table. David had grown up watching his brilliant father, also an architect, slowly dissolve his career and his marriage into a series of slurred conversations and missed deadlines. "I'm not like him," David had told himself at 25, watching his father stumble through a family dinner. "I'm smarter, more disciplined, more aware." But awareness, David reasoned, required strategy. His father had been careless with alcohol, treating it like any other beverage instead of respecting its power to derail even the most successful people. David would be different. David would be systematic. So when David decided to incorporate wine into his life, naturally, He approached it like any other design challenge. It started during a business dinner at Altura, one of Seattle's finest restaurants. David was dining with the planning committee for what would become the Harbor View project, and he watched as his potential clients discussed wine with an easy sophistication that impressed him. The way they swirled their glasses, the casual references to regions and vintages, the way the wine seemed to unlock a different kind of conversation, more creative, more personal, more human. David made a mental note. This was a skill worth acquiring. He spent the following weekend at Elliott Bay Book Company, gathering resources. 3 books on wine appreciation, 2 on food pairing, and a slim volume titled The Architecture of Taste, Understanding Wine Through Structure. Perfect. By the end of the month, David had developed what he privately called his sustainable drinking architecture. Rule 1. Wine only, never spirits. Wine had complexity, history, craft. It was the architectural equivalent of beverages. Rule 2. Only with food, preferably dinner. This wasn't about intoxication. It was about enhancement, appreciation, sophistication. Rule 3. Never before 6 p.m. This maintained the boundary between professional David and cultured David. Rule 4. Maximum 2 glasses. This was based on his research into optimal appreciation zones, enough to experience the wine's evolution as it opened up, but not enough to impair judgment or blur the experience. Rule 5. Only Friday and Saturday evenings, with occasional exceptions for client dinners or special occasions. Structure created freedom, he told himself. Boundaries made beauty possible. Maya loved this version of David. She'd watch him at dinner parties, explaining his approach with the same passionate precision he brought to discussing sustainable building materials or natural lighting systems. He'd gesture with his wine glass, mapping out the relationship between tannins and time, between terroir and architecture. See, he'd say to their friends, most people approach drinking emotionally, impulsively, but wine is a craft, like design. It deserves intention, respect, system. Maya would smile and squeeze his hand under the table. This was David at his best. Brilliant, passionate, completely in control of his expertise. For 8 months, David's system worked flawlessly. His Friday evening wine ritual became something he looked forward to all week. The walk to Pike Place Market, selecting a bottle with the same care he'd used choosing materials for a project. The careful decanting, the proper glassware, the deliberate tasting notes he'd record in a leather-bound journal. Maya would cook. They'd talk about their weeks, and David would guide them through the wine's flavor profile, like a docent leading a tour through a gallery. These evenings felt sophisticated, European, mature. David felt like he was living the life he'd always imagined successful people lived. But systems, David knew from his architectural training, were only as strong as their unexpected stresses. The first crack appeared on a Wednesday evening in November. The Meridian Medical Center project had hit an unexpected snag. The City Planning Commission wanted revisions to the emergency vehicle access, changes that would require redesigning the entire ground floor circulation pattern. David had spent 14 hours at his drafting table, surviving on coffee and the kind of focused intensity that felt both exhilarating and exhausting. Maya was working late at the clinic where she was doing her practicum. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. David found himself standing in the kitchen, looking at the wine rack. Just looking. It wasn't really breaking the rules, he reasoned. It was Wednesday, yes, but it was also a special circumstance. High stress, exceptional workload, and besides, wasn't there something arbitrary about Tuesday being different from Friday? Wine didn't change its chemical composition based on the day of the week. He selected a bottle of Sangiovese, something that would pair well with the leftover pasta in the refrigerator. The familiar ritual felt soothing. The cork's gentle pop, the wine's garnet color catching the under-cabinet lighting, the first sip rolling across his palate. One glass became two as David reviewed his revision plans. The wine helped him see the design problems differently, more creatively. By the time Maya came home at 11 p.m., David had solved the circulation issue and was feeling pleased with himself. The next morning, reviewing his solution over coffee, David felt a small, nagging sensation. Not guilt exactly, but irregularity. His system had experienced what engineers would call a fault tolerance event. No problem, he told himself, sitting down at his computer to update his drinking protocols. Systems evolved. That's what made them robust. He'd simply adjust the parameters to account for high-stress exceptions. After all, everything could be optimized. He just needed better data. The beauty of David's mind was its ability to learn from failure. In architecture, when a design didn't work, you didn't abandon the project. You revised the plans. You identified the weak points, strengthened the foundation, adjusted the load calculations, and built something better. So when David woke up that Thursday morning, slightly fuzzy from his Wednesday evening wine, he didn't see a drinking problem. He saw a systems problem. Sitting at his kitchen island with his morning coffee and a fresh legal pad, David began what would become a familiar ritual: the revision process. At the top of the page, he wrote Drinking Protocol 2.0 in his precise architectural lettering. The issue, he determined, wasn't the wine itself. The issue was that his original parameters hadn't accounted for variable stress levels. Any good system needed to anticipate unusual circumstances. His mistake had been creating rigid rules instead of flexible guidelines that could adapt to real-world conditions. Version 2.0 included what he called stress exemptions: high-pressure work situations, family emergencies, exceptional circumstances. These would allow for protocol modifications, but only with specific safeguards in place. Maximum 1 glass during stress exemptions. Never more than 2 exemptions per month. Always log the reasoning in his wine journal for future analysis. David felt pleased with this revision. It showed growth, adaptability, sophisticated thinking. He wasn't some rigid rule follower who couldn't adjust to circumstances. He was an engineer optimizing a system based on new data. The new protocol worked beautifully for 6 weeks. Then came the client dinner that changed everything. Peterson and Associates had invited David to discuss a potential collaboration on their biggest project yet, a mixed-use development that would reshape an entire city block. The dinner was at Canley's, Seattle's most prestigious restaurant, with views of Lake Union that made David's architect's heart sing. The clients were wine enthusiasts, the kind who spoke in vintages and appellations. When they ordered a bottle of Barolo that cost more than David's monthly car payment, he felt the familiar pull, the desire to be sophisticated, knowledgeable, worthy of this level of success. 2 glasses turned into 3 as the conversation flowed around design philosophies and urban planning principles. 3 became 4 when Peterson himself refilled David's glass while discussing the project timeline. By the time they moved to dessert wine, David had lost count entirely. The evening was a triumph professionally. The clients loved his vision for the project. Peterson clapped him on the shoulder and promised the contract would be ready by Friday. David felt brilliant, creative, connected in a way that seemed impossible without the wine's warm amplification of his natural charm. But Friday morning brought the familiar nagging sensation, stronger this time. His system hadn't just experienced a fault, it had experienced what engineers called cascading failure. Time for Protocol 3.0. The problem, David realized, was that he'd been thinking too narrowly. His rules needed to account for business entertaining, which was fundamentally different from personal consumption. He created two separate frameworks: personal consumption guidelines and professional consumption parameters. Personal guidelines remained strict. Weekends only, 2 glasses maximum, wine with dinner. Professional parameters allowed for greater flexibility during client entertainment, but with built-in safeguards. Never drink more than the client. Always eat substantial food, alternate wine with water, and maintain professional demeanor at all times. David spent an entire Sunday creating detailed flowcharts for different scenarios. Client dinner? Follow the professional parameters. Stress from work? Apply the limited stress exemption protocol. Date night with Maya? Standard personal guidelines. He even created a small laminated card for his wallet with the key decision points outlined clearly. Maya found the card 2 weeks later while looking for cash to tip the pizza delivery driver. She held it up with a mixture of amusement and concern. "Babe," she said, This is a decision tree for drinking wine." David looked up from his laptop where he was working on the Peterson project. "It's just organization. You know how I am with systems." "But it's wine, David. It's not a building code." He could see she was trying to understand, trying to be supportive. Maya was studying to be a therapist, which meant she had opinions about behavior and patterns and underlying motivations. David appreciated her analytical mind, but sometimes her training made her see pathology where there was simply preference for structure. "I like having clear parameters," he explained. "It prevents impulsive decisions. It's actually quite healthy to think things through ahead of time, rather than just winging it." Maya sat down beside him, still holding the card. "But who needs this much structure around something that's supposed to be relaxing and enjoyable?" David felt a flicker of irritation. Plenty of people. Anyone who takes wine seriously has guidelines. Sommeliers have incredibly detailed protocols for tasting. Wine collectors have elaborate storage systems. This isn't weird, Maya. This is thorough. She was quiet for a moment, studying the flowchart. "It just seems like a lot of mental energy to spend on when and how to have a glass of wine." "Everything worth doing is worth doing well," David replied, turning back to his laptop. But Maya's words followed him like an architectural echo, bouncing around in spaces he preferred to keep closed. The Peterson project became David's white whale. The mixed-use development was the most complex design challenge he'd ever undertaken. Retail space, office buildings, residential units, and a public plaza, all integrated into a seamless urban environment. Every system had to work in harmony. Traffic flow, utilities, emergency access, natural lighting, pedestrian circulation. David worked longer hours than ever before, often staying at the office until 9 or 10 p.m. The project demanded perfection, and perfection required time. Maya's practicum hours at the clinic meant she was often working late too, so David frequently found himself alone with his thoughts and his increasingly elaborate drinking protocols. The protocols had evolved again. Version 4.0 now included subcategories for different types of work stress. High creativity tasks might warrant a glass of wine to enhance creative thinking. detail-oriented work required complete sobriety for precision. Client meetings fell under professional parameters unless they involved design presentations, which created their own subset of guidelines. David had also begun tracking his consumption in a spreadsheet, noting correlations between wine intake and work performance, mood, sleep quality, and creative output. The data was fascinating. There seemed to be an optimal zone where wine enhanced his architectural thinking without compromising his technical precision. But the Peterson project kept hitting obstacles. The city planning department wanted modifications to the residential density. The environmental impact assessment required redesigning the stormwater management. The public input sessions generated complaints about building height and parking ratios. Each setback sent David back to his drafting table for another late-night revision session. Each late night seemed to call for a glass of wine to ease the transition from analytical thinking to creative problem-solving. Each glass required consultation with his increasingly complex decision matrix. Maya began finding empty wine bottles in David's home office recycling bin. Always just one bottle, never more, but appearing with increasing frequency. When she asked about them, David would reference his protocols: stress exemption, creative enhancement, professional development. He had documentation for everything. "David," Maya said one evening, finding him at his drafting table with a glass of Pinot Noir and a pile of revised building plans. "Are you drinking alone more often lately?" David looked up from his calculations for elevator shaft placement. "I'm not drinking alone. I'm drinking while working. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Of course there is. Professional wine tasters work alone all the time. Artists have been using wine to enhance creativity for centuries. This isn't social drinking, Maya. It's practical application." Maya sat down in the chair across from his drafting table, the one he'd carefully positioned for client consultations. When you create spreadsheets to track your wine consumption, and flowcharts to decide when to drink, and stress level categories to justify drinking on Tuesday nights, doesn't that seem like maybe wine has become more complicated than it needs to be? David set down his pencil and really looked at her. Maya's dark hair was pulled back in the messy bun she wore when she was thinking hard about something. Her expression held the careful neutrality he recognized from her therapy training. Engaged but non-judgmental. Concerned but not confrontational. "I think," David said slowly, "that you're pathologizing normal organizational behavior. Just because I'm systematic about something doesn't mean it's problematic. I'm systematic about everything, Maya. It's who I am. But you weren't systematic about wine when we first started dating. You just enjoyed it sometimes." David felt that familiar flicker of irritation, stronger now. "And now I enjoy it more intelligently, with intention and awareness instead of just randomly consuming alcohol like most people do." Maya was quiet for a long moment, watching him. Finally, she said, "What happens if your system doesn't work? What happens if all these protocols and guidelines and stress categories don't actually help you control your drinking?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a faulty ventilation system. David felt something shift inside him, a structural uncertainty he didn't like. "That won't happen," he said, turning back to his plans. "Everything can be optimized. I just haven't found the right solution yet." But as Maya went to bed and David returned to his calculations, her question echoed in his mind. What if the problem wasn't his system? What if the problem was thinking he needed a system at all? David poured himself another glass of wine and pushed the thought away. The Peterson project needed his full attention. Everything else could wait until morning, when he could think about it clearly, systematically, properly. After all, every building started with a solid foundation, and David's foundation was control. Even if that foundation was showing hairline cracks, he refused to see. The Riverside Children's Hospital project should have been David's masterpiece, a healing environment for sick children, where natural light would stream through carefully calculated windows, where every corridor would feel welcoming rather than clinical, where families could find moments of peace within the architecture itself. Instead, it had become David's personal hell. 4 times now, the design had been rejected by the hospital board. 4 complete revisions, each one representing months of work, hundreds of hours at the drafting table, countless consultations with medical staff and child psychologists and building engineers. The first rejection focused on the emergency vehicle access. David had prioritized aesthetic integration over ambulance turning radiuses, creating a beautiful curved driveway that looked stunning in renderings, but couldn't accommodate the hospital's largest emergency vehicles. The second rejection centered on infection control protocols. David's open, flowing design concept conflicted with the need for isolated air handling systems and sterilization barriers. Beautiful, yes. Functional for containing airborne pathogens. Number. The third rejection hit David like a demolition ball to the chest. The budget. His soaring atrium and therapeutic gardens and hand-selected materials had pushed the cost 40% over the hospital's funding capacity. Beauty, it turned out, was expensive. And now, this fourth rejection, delivered on a gray Tuesday morning in March, while David sat in the hospital conference room surrounded by board members and administrators and his own mounting sense of professional failure. The issue this time was the most fundamental of all: patient safety. The fire marshal had identified 17 code violations in David's revised plans. Exit routes that were too narrow, stairwells that didn't meet accessibility requirements, emergency lighting systems that hadn't been properly integrated into the design. David sat in his car in the hospital parking lot afterward, staring at the rejection letter, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. He was a good architect. More than good. He was meticulous, thorough, systematic. His buildings didn't have safety violations. His calculations were always precise. But lately, precision felt elusive. Details seemed to slip through his fingers like water through a broken foundation. The harder he worked, the more mistakes appeared in his plans. Maya had moved out 3 weeks earlier. Not dramatically, not with shouting or accusations, just quietly, systematically, like someone carefully dismantling a structure that was no longer safe to inhabit. "I can't watch you disappear into your systems anymore," she'd said, standing in their living room with 2 suitcases and a sadness that David couldn't engineer away. "Every conversation we have is filtered through your protocols and guidelines and decision trees. I miss the person you used to be before everything became a problem to be solved." David had tried to explain that he wasn't disappearing, he was optimizing, that his systems were making him better, more efficient, more in control of his life and his work and his choices. "David," Maya had said softly, "you have a laminated card in your wallet that tells you when you're allowed to drink wine. You have spreadsheets tracking your alcohol consumption cross-referenced with your work performance. You spend more time managing your drinking than most people spend drinking." "That's called being responsible," David had replied. But even as he said it, the words felt hollow. Maya had kissed his forehead, the kind of gentle goodbye kiss you might give someone who was very sick, and walked out of his perfectly organized life. Now, sitting in the hospital parking lot with his 4th rejection letter, David felt the familiar pull toward home, toward the wine rack, toward the temporary peace that came with a perfectly measured glass of Cabernet Sauvignon. But it was 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. His protocols clearly stated no drinking before 6 p.m., and never on weekdays except for client entertainment or documented stress exemptions. The hospital rejection certainly qualified as a stress exemption, but he'd already used his 2 monthly stress exemptions this week. Monday's revision deadline and Friday's budget meeting both qualified as exceptional circumstances. David sat in his car and realized he was having an internal argument with a system he'd created to prevent internal arguments. He drove home to his empty apartment and sat at his drafting table, staring at the wine rack Maya had helped him select 2 years earlier. 18 bottles, each one carefully chosen, properly stored, waiting for the appropriate moment according to his ever-evolving protocols. What if he just ignored the protocols? What if he had a glass of wine because he wanted one? Because his professional life was falling apart? Because his girlfriend had left him? Because sitting alone in his apartment at 3:30 on a Tuesday felt like inhabiting a building with no doors? But that way lay chaos. That way lay the kind of impulsive, emotional decision-making that led to problems. David's systems existed for a reason. They kept him safe, successful, in control. Instead, he pulled out a fresh sheet of drafting paper. If his drinking protocols weren't working, if they weren't preventing the kind of stress that led to professional mistakes and relationship failures, then clearly the protocols needed revision. Not abandonment. Revision. David began to sketch. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Integrated Life Management System Alcohol Component," in the precise lettering he'd learned in architectural school. Below that, he began drawing what could only be described as a blueprint for controlled drinking. He mapped out his apartment like a floor plan, noting optimal drinking locations and prohibited zones. The kitchen island, approved for weekend evening consumption. The living room couch, approved for social consumption only. His home office, emergency stress exemptions only, maximum 1 glass, must be accompanied by substantial food intake. He created flowcharts showing decision trees for different scenarios. Work stress versus personal stress. Client entertainment versus social gathering. Weekend versus weekday. Indoor versus outdoor dining. Each pathway led to specific protocols, maximum quantities, time restrictions, documentation requirements. He drew timelines showing optimal consumption windows, cross-referenced with his work schedule, sleep patterns, and exercise routine. He calculated metabolic processing rates and created charts showing blood alcohol content projections for different consumption patterns. As the afternoon faded into evening, David's blueprint grew more elaborate. He added color coding. He included elevation views showing proper glassware positioning. He drew detailed sections explaining wine storage temperatures and serving protocols. Somewhere around 7 p.m., as David was adding specifications for a wine consumption tracking app he was considering developing, he stopped drawing. He looked up from his drafting table and saw his apartment as if from a great height, like an architect reviewing aerial photographs of a building site. The kitchen counter was covered with empty wine bottles from his recent stress exemptions. His coffee table held 3 different versions of his drinking protocols, each one more complex than the last. His laptop displayed the spreadsheet where he tracked his consumption patterns, complete with graphs and trend analysis. And here he sat, at his professional drafting table, creating technical drawings to manage his relationship with a beverage. David set down his pencil and looked at what he'd drawn, really looked at it. A grown man. A successful architect. Someone who designed buildings where children would be healed, where families would find shelter, where communities would gather, and he was creating architectural plans for drinking wine. The absurdity hit him like a structural failure in slow motion. All his systems, all his protocols, all his careful calculations and decision trees and flowcharts, they weren't evidence of control. They were evidence of how completely out of control he actually was. A person in control didn't need 47 different rules to manage 2 glasses of wine. A person in control didn't create spreadsheets to track their consumption of a legal beverage. A person in control didn't lose their girlfriend and their major project, and spend their evening drawing blueprints for drinking. David's hands began to shake slightly as he looked around his apartment. When had his life become this elaborate prison of his own design? When had every simple pleasure become a complex problem requiring systematic solutions? He remembered something Maya had said during one of their last conversations, something he'd dismissed at the time as therapists speak. She'd been sitting in the same chair where she'd later tell him she was moving out, watching him consult his decision matrix before opening a bottle of wine with dinner. "David," she'd said quietly, "you're trying to engineer your way out of a feeling. But feelings aren't structural problems. They're not broken buildings that need better blueprints. Sometimes the only way through a feeling is through it." He'd argued with her then, explained that emotional intelligence was just intelligence applied to emotions, that systematic thinking was always better than impulsive feeling, that his approaches were mature and sophisticated and healthy. But sitting alone in his apartment, surrounded by the architectural evidence of his own powerlessness, David began to understand what Maya had been trying to tell him. He wasn't managing his drinking. His drinking was managing him. Every protocol he created, every system he revised, every flowchart he designed, they were all elaborate ways of avoiding a simple truth. He couldn't control this. Not with better rules, not with more sophisticated systems, not with architectural precision or engineering expertise or systematic thinking. He couldn't control this, and all his blueprints and protocols were just increasingly desperate attempts to avoid admitting that fundamental fact. David looked down at his elaborate drinking blueprint, with its color-coded zones and calculated consumption windows and detailed specifications for optimal wine enjoyment, and saw it for what it really was. It was the technical drawing of a prison, a beautiful, well-designed, carefully engineered prison, but a prison nonetheless. And he was both the architect and the prisoner. For the first time in months, David wanted a drink, not because his protocols allowed it, not because he'd calculated it into his system, not because it fit his guidelines for stress management or creative enhancement or professional development. He wanted a drink because admitting powerlessness felt like drowning, and wine felt like the only life preserver he knew how to reach for. Instead, he picked up his phone and typed a search that would change everything. Alcoholics Anonymous meetings near me. Because if his blueprints had become prisons, maybe it was time to find a different kind of architect. Maybe it was time to learn how to build his life on a foundation he'd never considered before. The foundation of letting go. The search results showed 17 different AA meetings within a 10-mile radius of David's apartment. Tuesday night meetings, morning meetings, lunch meetings, weekend meetings. Big book studies and step studies, and newcomer meetings and women's meetings, and men's meetings and meetings for young people. And meetings for people in specific professions. David spent 45 minutes creating a spreadsheet to analyze the options. Location versus convenience, meeting size versus anonymity, format preferences versus scheduling compatibility. He was halfway through calculating optimal driving routes when he stopped himself. He was doing it again. systematizing, organizing, trying to engineer the perfect approach to admitting he couldn't engineer his way through this problem. David closed his laptop, grabbed his keys, and drove to the first meeting he could find. Tuesday night, 7:30, basement of First Presbyterian Church on Capitol Hill. The church building was older than anything David had ever designed, built in an era when architects still believed in ornament and flourish and the kind of decorative details that modern efficiency had eliminated. He parked across the street and sat in his car for 15 minutes, watching people walk down the side stairs toward a basement entrance marked only by a small sign, Meeting Room B. They looked normal. A woman in scrubs who might be a nurse getting off shift. An older man in a business suit checking his phone. A younger guy in construction clothes carrying a thermos of coffee. A woman about Maya's age with a yoga mat slung over her shoulder. David had expected something different. More obvious signs of what? Failure? Desperation? Rock bottom? These people looked like they could be his clients, his neighbors, his colleagues. At 7:28, David finally walked down those stairs. The basement smelled like old coffee and floor wax, and something indefinable that might have been decades of honest conversation. Folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, a small table with literature and a coffee pot that had seen better days. Maybe 20 people scattered around the room, some chatting quietly, others sitting alone. David took a chair near the back and tried to make himself invisible. The meeting opened with readings he didn't understand, references to steps and traditions and a higher power that made his architect's mind want to ask for structural drawings and load calculations. Then people started sharing. The first speaker was the woman in scrubs. Susan, she said her name was, and she was grateful to be sober today. She talked about her shift at the hospital, about how she used to steal alcohol-based hand sanitizer when she couldn't get to a bottle, about how she'd once passed out in a supply closet during her lunch break and woke up to her supervisor shaking her shoulder. David felt a flicker of superiority. He'd never stolen hand sanitizer. He'd never passed out at work. He had wine with dinner at nice restaurants, not whatever this was. But then the business suit man spoke. Robert, recently retired from a consulting firm, talking about how he'd spent his last 5 years of work creating elaborate systems to hide his drinking. Strategic meeting scheduling to avoid morning appointments. Bathroom breaks timed with bourbon flask consumption. Complex rotation of restaurants and liquor stores so no one would notice his purchasing patterns. He'd been functionally alcoholic for 20 years, he said, and the emphasis on functionally had fooled everyone, including himself. David shifted in his chair. That sounded familiar. Then the construction worker, Mike, who'd managed construction projects while drinking a case of beer every day, who'd created detailed safety protocols for his job sites while being too drunk to follow them himself, who'd been hospitalized after falling off scaffolding because his depth perception was impaired, and he'd been too proud to admit he shouldn't be climbing anything higher than a step stool. David's mouth felt dry. The stories continued around the circle. A teacher who'd graded papers with a glass of wine that became a bottle. A stay-at-home mom who'd timed her drinking to her children's nap schedules. A programmer who'd written code for alcohol tracking apps while consuming a bottle of whiskey every night. Each story was different. Each story was the same. Smart people trying to control something that couldn't be controlled. Successful people creating systems to manage something that was managing them. Professionals applying their expertise to a problem that expertise couldn't solve. When it came time for David to introduce himself, he said, "I'm David, and I think I might be in the wrong place." A few people chuckled, not meanly. The meeting leader, an older woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, said, "What makes you think that, David?" "I'm not. I've never lost a job or been arrested or anything like that. I just. I think maybe I spend too much mental energy thinking about drinking." "How much mental energy?" the woman asked gently. David looked around the circle of faces, all focused on him with the attention that felt neither judgmental nor pitying, just interested, present. "I have spreadsheets," he said quietly, "and flowcharts, and decision trees, and protocols for different types of stress and work situations and social circumstances. I have a laminated card in my wallet with drinking guidelines. I created a blueprint, an actual architectural blueprint, for how to manage my wine consumption." The room was very quiet. "I'm an architect," David continued, feeling words spill out like water through a broken dam. "I design buildings. I solve complex structural problems for a living. But I've spent more time in the last 6 months designing systems to control my drinking than I've spent on my actual job. And my girlfriend left me because she said I was disappearing into my systems. And I just got my 4th project rejection because I've been making mistakes, sloppy calculations, missing safety requirements." David stopped talking and looked down at his hands. Hands that had drawn thousands of precise lines, calculated load-bearing requirements, designed spaces where people could live and work and heal. Hands that shook slightly when he thought about admitting what felt like the most shameful truth of his life. "I can't control it," he whispered. "I've tried everything I know how to try, every systematic approach, every protocol and guideline and management strategy. I'm supposed to be good at solving problems, but I can't solve this." The meeting leader smiled at him with a warmth that reminded David of his grandmother, who died when he was 12, and who'd been the last person to love him unconditionally. "Congratulations, David," she said. "You just took the first step." After the meeting, Robert approached him in the parking lot. Up close, David could see that the man's expensive suit was slightly rumpled, his tie loosened, his eyes holding the same mixture of exhaustion and relief that David felt in his own chest. "The systems thing," Robert said without preamble. "I did that too. Had a whole elaborate rotation schedule for which liquor stores I'd visit, which days I'd drink what amounts, how to space out my consumption so my wife wouldn't notice the patterns. Took me 3 years to realize that normal drinkers don't need systems to manage their drinking." "What do normal drinkers do?" David asked. Robert laughed, not bitterly. "They have a beer, or they don't have a beer. They don't create flowcharts about it." David felt something loosen in his chest, some tightly held belief about his own sophistication and control beginning to dissolve. "The thing about being smart," Robert continued, "is that it takes us longer to hit bottom because we're so good at engineering better and better ways to pretend we're not falling. But eventually, all the systems in the world can't hold up a foundation that was never solid to begin with." David looked up at the church, its old stone walls solid and simple, built to last without complexity or clever engineering tricks. Just stone on stone, weight properly distributed, foundations sunk deep enough to hold. How do you live without systems?" David asked. "One day at a time," Robert said, and for the first time in months, David heard something that sounded simpler and more reliable than any protocol he'd ever designed. "Want to grab coffee sometime this week?" Robert asked. "I know a place that serves terrible coffee in chipped mugs. No decision trees required." David smiled, realizing it was the first time he'd smiled in weeks. I'd like that. Driving home, David felt like he was seeing his neighborhood for the first time. The buildings he passed looked different somehow, less like problems to be solved and more like places where people lived, imperfectly and without elaborate systems for managing their daily existence. At home, he sat at his drafting table and looked at the drinking blueprint he'd created earlier. The careful calculations, the color-coded zones, the detailed specifications for optimal consumption management. It looked less like architectural genius and more like the frantic scratching of someone trying to dig their way out of a hole with increasingly complex shovels. David picked up the blueprint and, for the first time in his adult life, threw away something he'd spent hours designing. He didn't need a system for that decision. He didn't need to calculate the optimal disposal method or create protocols for future blueprint management. He just let it go. Tomorrow, he would start learning how to build his life on a completely different kind of foundation. Not the foundation of control and systems and elaborate management strategies. The foundation of admitting what he couldn't control. And maybe, just maybe, that foundation would prove more solid than anything his engineering mind had ever designed. David fell asleep that night without consulting any protocols, without checking any spreadsheets, without reviewing any guidelines for optimal sleep scheduling. He just slept. And for the first time in months, he didn't dream about blueprints. David had researched AA meetings the way he researched everything else, thoroughly, systematically, with the kind of methodical preparation that had served him well in every other area of his life. He'd read the official literature, studied the format descriptions, even watched YouTube videos of what meetings supposedly looked like. Based on his research, David expected something structured, organized, professional. Perhaps a facilitator with credentials, maybe some kind of curriculum or syllabus. Certainly a clear agenda and defined learning objectives. What he expected was something he could analyze, understand, and potentially optimize. What he found was chaos. The basement of First Presbyterian Church looked like it had been decorated by a committee of people who'd never met each other. Mismatched folding chairs arranged in a rough circle, some facing slightly the wrong direction. A card table covered with a stained tablecloth holding a coffee pot that gurgled ominously and a collection of styrofoam cups that had seen better days. Handwritten signs taped to the walls at odd angles. Keep coming back. It works if you work it. Progress, not perfection. And there, spanning the entire back wall like some kind of architectural blueprint for human behavior, were the 12 steps printed in large, bold letters on what appeared to be a banner made from bedsheets. David's architect's eye immediately cataloged the design flaws. The banner hung crooked, held up by pushpins that had created small tears in the fabric. The font was inconsistent, some steps printed in all caps, others in mixed case, as if different people had contributed different sections. The whole thing looked like it had been assembled by well-meaning volunteers who'd never heard of alignment or visual hierarchy. But it was the content that made David's stomach clench. Step 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Powerless. Unmanageable. David stared at those words while people filtered into the room around him. Everything in his professional training, his personal philosophy, his fundamental understanding of how to live successfully in the world rebelled against those concepts. Powerless meant failure. Powerless meant giving up. Powerless meant admitting defeat in the face of a problem that should be solvable through proper analysis and systematic approach. And unmanageable? David's life was the opposite of unmanageable. He had systems for everything: color-coded calendars and optimized workflows and documented processes for every aspect of his existence. His apartment was organized. His projects were methodically planned. His finances were tracked to the penny. Sure, he'd been having some difficulties lately. The Peterson project setbacks, Maya moving out, the hospital rejections, but these were temporary challenges, isolated incidents that required better systems, not evidence of fundamental unmanageability. David was still staring at the banner when the meeting officially began, and immediately his engineering mind started cataloging inefficiencies. People talked over each other during the opening moments. Someone's cell phone rang twice before they managed to turn it off. A woman near the front interrupted the opening reading to ask if anyone had seen her keys. The person leading the meeting, an older man in a faded flannel shirt, kept losing his place and having to start paragraphs over. "Hi, I'm Frank, and I'm an alcoholic," the man said, and David felt a jolt of surprise. Just like that? No credentials, no introduction of qualifications, no establishment of authority? Just a name and an admission? "Hi, Frank," the room responded in unison, and David felt like he'd stumbled into some kind of ritualistic performance he didn't understand. Frank began reading from a small blue book, something about how the meeting was for people who wanted to stop drinking and stay stopped. The words washed over David while he mentally redesigned the room layout for better acoustic properties and sightlines. Then Frank asked if anyone was attending for the first time, and David realized with a start that this question was directed at him. "I'm David," he said simply, and listened to the room's welcoming response. The meeting continued with what Frank called sharing, though it seemed more like controlled chaos than any kind of structured information exchange. People raised their hands at random intervals, shared stories that seemed to have no clear point or conclusion, and referenced concepts David didn't understand. "I'm working step 4 with my sponsor," said a woman named Jennifer, and David wanted to ask what step 4 was, who determined sponsor qualifications, and whether there was a curriculum or timeline for this process. "My higher power showed me something today," said a man named Carlos, and David wondered about the theological implications and whether there were doctrinal requirements for participation. "I had a slip last weekend, but I'm back," said a young woman named Amy, and David couldn't understand why everyone responded with supportive murmurs instead of asking for a root cause analysis of the failure. But it was when they reached what Frank called step study that David felt his worldview truly challenged. "Tonight we're looking at step 1, Frank announced, and David's attention sharpened. Finally, some structured content he could analyze. Frank asked someone named Maria to read the step aloud, and there it was again. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. "Let's share about powerlessness," Frank said. "Who wants to start?" David expected some kind of definition, maybe a discussion of the term's clinical or psychological meaning. Instead, he got stories. Robert, the businessman David had met the week before, raised his hand. "I'm Robert, and I'm an alcoholic. I spent 5 years creating elaborate systems to hide my drinking from my wife. Rotating liquor stores, strategic meeting scheduling, complex alibis for my whereabouts. I thought I was being smart, but really I was just creating more and more complex ways to serve my addiction. All that intelligence, all that planning, all that systematic thinking. It was all in service of alcohol. I wasn't managing my drinking. My drinking was managing me." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That sounded uncomfortably familiar. A woman named Sarah spoke next. "I'm Sarah, and I'm an alcoholic. I was a nurse for 20 years, responsible for life and death decisions, managing complex medical situations with precision and competence. But I couldn't manage my wine consumption. I could calculate medication dosages to the milligram, but I couldn't stick to 2 glasses at dinner. I could handle medical emergencies, but I couldn't handle stress without alcohol. I was powerful at work and completely powerless at home. David's mouth felt dry. Then people began sharing about unmanageability, and the stories became even more uncomfortable. "I'm Tony, and I'm an alcoholic," said a man near the front. "I thought unmanageability meant dramatic consequences. Jail, job loss, homelessness. But for me, unmanageability was subtler. It was the mental energy I spent thinking about drinking. When I could drink, how much, whether people would notice, whether I had enough wine at home for the weekend. It was the constant internal negotiations and the exhaustion of maintaining all these rules and systems." David felt like Tony was describing his own internal landscape with uncomfortable accuracy. "I'm Jennifer, and I'm an alcoholic," said the woman who'd mentioned step 4 earlier. "Unmanageability was living in my head instead of living in my life. Always planning, always calculating, always trying to figure out how to drink without consequences. I managed everything except the thing that was actually managing me." As the discussion continued, David found himself studying the crooked banner on the wall. The imperfect alignment that had initially bothered him now seemed almost honest. These weren't corporate mission statements or carefully crafted policy documents. These were working tools, functional rather than beautiful, effectiveness prioritized over appearance. Maybe the chaos wasn't a flaw in the system. Maybe the chaos was the point. When Frank asked if anyone else wanted to share about step 1, David surprised himself by raising his hand. "I'm David," he said, and waited for the reflexive, "Hi, David" response. "I think I'm struggling with the powerlessness part because I've built my entire life around being powerful. I'm an architect. I solve problems. I create systems. I design solutions for complex challenges." David paused, looking around the circle of faces. "But I've spent the last year creating increasingly complex systems to manage my drinking. Spreadsheets, flowcharts, protocols, decision trees. I have rules for different types of stress, different social situations, different work circumstances. I even drew an architectural blueprint for optimal wine consumption." A few people nodded with recognition, not judgment. "And the thing that's really bothering me is that I keep thinking if I just create a better system, a more sophisticated approach, I can solve this problem. But sitting here listening to everyone, I'm starting to wonder if treating this like a design challenge is actually the problem." David looked back at the banner, at the word powerless in its imperfect font and crooked alignment. "I think maybe the reason I need so many systems is because I'm trying to control something that can't be controlled. And all these protocols and guidelines, they're not evidence of power. They're evidence of powerlessness disguised as intelligence." The room was quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. David continued, "I lost my girlfriend 3 weeks ago. She said I was disappearing into my systems. And I just got my 4th project rejection because I've been making mistakes, sloppy calculations, missing safety requirements. The harder I try to control my drinking, the more out of control everything else becomes." He took a shaky breath. "I don't know how to live without managing everything. The idea of being powerless feels like architectural failure. But maybe that's exactly what I need to learn." As the meeting ended with everyone holding hands and reciting something called the Serenity Prayer, David felt the strangest sensation. Standing in this chaotic, poorly organized, completely unoptimized room, surrounded by people who'd admitted they couldn't control something fundamental about their lives. David felt more honest than he'd felt in months. After the prayer, as people began stacking chairs and cleaning up, Robert approached David. "That was brave," Robert said quietly. "Sharing like that your first time." David looked around at the organized chaos of people cleaning up. "I don't know what else to do. All my systems are failing." "That's actually good news," Robert said, and David must have looked confused because he continued. "When the systems fail, that's when the real work can begin. Want to grab coffee? I know a place that serves terrible coffee in chipped mugs. No decision trees required." David smiled, realizing it was the first time he'd smiled in weeks. "I'd like that." Walking to his car afterward, David looked back at the church building. It had been built over a century ago, long before modern building codes and energy efficiency standards and seismic safety requirements. By contemporary architectural standards, it was suboptimal in almost every way. But it was still standing, still serving its purpose, still providing shelter for people who needed it. Maybe there was something to be learned from that kind of functional imperfection. Maybe the blueprint for his life didn't need to be perfect to be strong. Maybe it just needed to be honest. Part 6. The Limits of Intelligence. The coffee shop Robert chose was everything David's systematized mind would normally reject. Mismatched furniture that looked like it had been collected from estate sales over several decades. Wobbly tables that required napkin shims to sit level. A menu board with half the letters missing, forcing customers to decode what "sia pukchek no" and "siar sant" might mean. But the coffee was hot, the shop was quiet, and Robert seemed completely at ease in the organized chaos, which David found oddly comforting. "So," Robert said, settling into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight, "how are you feeling about your first meeting?" David wrapped his hands around his chipped ceramic mug, appreciating the warmth. "Honestly, I'm trying to figure out how the program works. I mean, I understand the concept of admitting powerlessness intellectually, but I'm having trouble seeing the practical application. What's the methodology? What are the measurable outcomes? How do you track progress?" Robert smiled, the kind of gentle smile David was beginning to recognize from AA meetings. Not condescending, but knowing. Like someone watching a child try to hammer a screw into wood. "David," Robert said carefully, "can I ask you something? In your work, when you're designing a building, what's the first thing you do when you encounter a structural problem?" "Research," David said immediately. "I analyze the load requirements, study the materials, calculate the stress factors, review similar projects, consult with engineers. I gather data and develop a systematic approach to the solution." "Right. You figure it out." "Exactly." Robert leaned back in his chair, which creaked again. "That's your superpower, isn't it? Your ability to figure things out. Analyze, systematize, solve." David felt a flicker of pride. "I suppose so. It's served me well professionally." "I'm sure it has," Robert said. "But here's the thing, David. Figure it out is not one of the 12 steps." David blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said. Nowhere in the 12 steps does it say analyze the problem or develop a systematic approach or create a management strategy. The steps don't ask you to figure anything out." David set down his coffee cup, feeling something shift uncomfortably in his chest. But that doesn't make sense. How do you solve a problem without figuring it out? That's the point, Robert said gently. This isn't a problem to be solved. It's a condition to be accepted. But that's... David searched for words. That's giving up. That's admitting defeat. Is it? Robert asked. Or is it admitting reality? David felt his engineering mind rebelling against this concept. Robert, I appreciate what you're saying, but I've built my entire career on the premise that every problem has a solution. You just have to be smart enough, thorough enough, systematic enough to find it. If I can design a building that will stand for 100 years, surely I can figure out how to manage my relationship with alcohol. Robert was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee with a plastic spoon that had seen better days. Can I tell you about my last attempt to figure it out? David nodded, grateful for what felt like a return to concrete information. I was a management consultant, Robert began. I helped Fortune 500 companies optimize their operations. I was very good at identifying inefficiencies and designing solutions. So when my drinking started causing problems, I naturally applied the same methodology. Robert pulled out his phone and showed David a screenshot of what appeared to be a complex spreadsheet. I created a comprehensive alcohol management system. I tracked consumption patterns, mood correlations, productivity metrics, sleep quality, social interactions, work performance. I had charts showing optimal consumption windows, graphs predicting high-risk scenarios, algorithms for calculating acceptable intake based on stress levels and social circumstances. David leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. Did it work? Oh, it worked beautifully, Robert said with a bitter laugh. For about 3 months. The data was fascinating. I could predict with remarkable accuracy when I'd be most likely to exceed my consumption targets. I could correlate my drinking patterns with work stress, relationship conflicts, seasonal changes. I knew exactly which variables contributed to my drinking events and which interventions were most effective. So what happened? I drank anyway, Robert said simply. All that analysis, all that systematic thinking, all that brilliant problem-solving, and I still drank anyway. Because the problem wasn't that I didn't understand my drinking. The problem was that I couldn't stop drinking, no matter how well I understood it. David felt like Robert was describing his own experience with uncomfortable accuracy. But surely understanding the patterns helps with control. Does it? Robert asked. You've been creating systems for over a year now. You've probably got more data about your drinking patterns than most researchers have about their subjects. Has all that understanding helped you control your consumption? David thought about the spreadsheets on his laptop, the decision trees in his wallet, the elaborate protocols he'd developed and revised and refined. The honest answer was uncomfortable. Sometimes, David said weakly. The systems work until they don't. Right, until they don't. And then what do you do? I create better systems. Exactly. You try to figure it out better, more thoroughly, more systematically. You apply more intelligence, more analysis, more sophisticated thinking. Because that's what intelligent people do when something doesn't work. They figure out how to make it work better. Robert leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. David, I need you to hear this. Your intelligence is not the solution to this problem. Your intelligence is part of the problem. David felt like he'd been slapped. What do you mean? I mean that your ability to analyze and systematize and create elegant solutions is exactly what's keeping you stuck. Every time you create a new protocol, every time you develop a more sophisticated management strategy, every time you think your way through a drinking decision, you're reinforcing the fundamental delusion that this is a problem you can solve through thinking. But thinking is how problems get solved, David protested. Some problems, Robert agreed. But not this one. This problem gets solved through surrender, not strategy. David felt something like panic rising in his chest. I don't understand what that means. Surrender to what? How do you solve something without trying to solve it? Robert smiled with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. You don't solve it, David. You accept it. You stop trying to manage your relationship with alcohol and start learning to live without alcohol. You stop trying to figure out how to drink successfully and start learning how to be successful without drinking. But David struggled for words. That's like telling an architect to design a building without considering structural engineering. It's abandoning the tools that actually work. Is drinking working for you? Robert asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. David thought about Maya packing her suitcases, about the hospital project rejections, about the elaborate blueprint for wine consumption he'd thrown away the night before. No, David admitted. It's not working. And have your systems for managing your drinking been working? Another long pause. Number, they haven't. So maybe, Robert said gently, the problem isn't that you need better systems. Maybe the problem is that you're trying to use systems to solve something that can't be systematized. David felt like his fundamental understanding of reality was being challenged. But if I don't try to figure this out, what do I do instead? You work the steps, Robert said. Not because you understand them, but because people who've been where you are tell you they work. You go to meetings, not because you've analyzed their effectiveness, but because staying sober matters more than understanding how sobriety works. You ask for help, not because you've designed an optimal help-seeking strategy, but because you can't do this alone. That sounds like faith, David said, and the word felt strange in his mouth. It is faith, Robert agreed. Faith in something other than your own intelligence. Faith in a process you don't control. Faith in the possibility that surrender might be more powerful than strategy. David stared into his coffee cup, watching the steam rise in unpredictable patterns. This is terrifying. I know it is, Robert said. For people like us, letting go of the need to figure everything out feels like free fall. But David, you've been trying to figure this out for over a year. How's that working out for you? David thought about the question seriously, reviewing the evidence with the same analytical precision he'd apply to any engineering problem. The data was clear. His systematic approach had failed repeatedly, each failure requiring more complex solutions, each solution ultimately proving inadequate. It's not working, David said finally. At all. So maybe it's time to try something different, Robert said. Maybe it's time to stop trying to be smarter than this problem and start learning to live with it instead. David looked around the coffee shop, at the imperfect furniture and the missing menu letters and the general organized chaos that somehow functioned perfectly well without systematic optimization. How do you learn to live with something without trying to control it? David asked. One day at a time, Robert said. One meeting at a time. One step at a time. Not because you understand the methodology, but because people who've done it before you say it works. David felt something loosening in his chest, some tightly held belief about his own capabilities beginning to dissolve. I don't know how to not try to figure things out. That's okay, Robert said. Nobody knows how to do this at first. That's why we ask for help. That's why we work with sponsors who've been through it. That's why we go to meetings where people share their experience instead of their expertise. Will you... David hesitated. Will you help me? I mean, would you consider being my sponsor? Robert smiled, and David saw something like joy in the older man's eyes. I'd be honored to help you, David, but I need you to understand something first. I'm not going to help you figure out how to work the program. I'm going to help you learn to work the program, whether you understand it or not. I think, David said slowly, that might be exactly what I need to learn. Walking back to his car, David felt like he was seeing the world through different eyes. The buildings around him looked less like problems to be solved and more like spaces where life happened, imperfectly and without elaborate management systems. For the first time in his adult life, David was contemplating the possibility that not understanding something might be more useful than understanding it. It was a thought that would have terrified him a week ago. Today, it felt like the first solid foundation he'd found in months. Maybe surrender wasn't about giving up. Maybe surrender was about giving in to something larger than his own need to be in control. Maybe that was the beginning of actual wisdom. David's apartment felt different when he walked through the door that evening. The same organized surfaces, the same color-coded calendar on his refrigerator, the same precisely arranged wine rack in the corner. But something had shifted in his perception, like looking at a familiar building and suddenly noticing its structural flaws. The wine rack drew his attention with an almost magnetic pull. 18 bottles, each one carefully selected, properly stored, waiting for the appropriate moment according to protocols he'd spent months developing and refining. His evening routine had always included at least considering wine, consulting his decision matrix, evaluating his stress levels, reviewing his consumption data from the previous week. Tonight, for the first time in over a year, David didn't have protocols to consult. He'd thrown away his elaborate blueprint, but he hadn't replaced it with anything. The absence of his systematic approach felt like standing in a doorway without a doorframe. David sat at his kitchen island and felt the familiar craving wash over him. Not just physical desire, but something deeper. The craving for the ritual, the anticipation, the way wine had made everything feel softer and more manageable. The craving for the temporary vacation from the constant pressure of optimizing and controlling and systematizing every aspect of his existence. His laptop sat open on the counter, and David's fingers moved toward the keyboard almost involuntarily. If he was going to give up his systematic approach to drinking, shouldn't he at least research the systematic approach to sobriety? Shouldn't he analyze the effectiveness of AA, understand the statistical success rates, review the clinical literature on addiction recovery? AA success rates, David typed into the search bar, and immediately found himself confronted with exactly the kind of data he'd been craving. Studies showing low long-term success rates, articles questioning the religious elements of the program, academic papers suggesting alternative approaches with better empirical support. David felt a familiar rush of intellectual satisfaction. This was what he was good at: research, analysis, critical thinking. If AA's success rates were questionable, maybe his systematic approach hadn't been the problem after all. Maybe he just needed to find a more evidence-based solution. He opened several browser tabs, diving deeper into the research. cognitive behavioral therapy for addiction, mindfulness-based relapse prevention, medication-assisted treatment, smart recovery. Each approach offered what his engineering mind craved: clear methodologies, measurable outcomes, systematic frameworks for understanding and managing addiction. 20 minutes into his research, David found himself creating a new spreadsheet comparing different treatment approaches: success rates, methodological advantages, cost-effectiveness, alignment with his personal preferences and professional background. He was halfway through calculating weighted scores for each option when he stopped. Robert's voice echoed in his mind. "Figure it out is not one of the 12 steps." David stared at his laptop screen, at the elaborate comparison matrix he'd been unconsciously creating. Here he was, less than 3 hours after admitting that his systematic approach had failed, trying to systematize his way out of systemization. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so depressing. David closed his laptop and looked around his apartment. The wine rack still called to him, but now it felt less like temptation and more like a test. What was he supposed to do with a Wednesday evening craving if he couldn't consult his protocols and couldn't research his way to a solution? He remembered Robert mentioning online meetings, not because he'd analyzed their effectiveness, but because he didn't know what else to do. David found himself back at the computer, but this time searching for AA meetings online instead of AA effectiveness research. Within minutes, he was logged into a virtual meeting room with participants from around the country. The format was familiar from his in-person meeting: readings, sharing, the same crooked banner virtually displayed in the background. But somehow, sitting in his own apartment, David felt less like an observer and more like a participant. When the meeting opened for sharing, David found himself unmuting his microphone. "I'm David, and I'm an alcoholic," he said, the words feeling strange but not untrue. "I went to my first in-person meeting yesterday, and I'm sitting here tonight wanting a glass of wine and wanting to research why AA doesn't work instead of just being here." A few people typed supportive comments in the chat. No one offered advice or solutions. They just acknowledged his struggle and shared their own similar experiences. "I'm supposed to be smart," David continued. "I'm supposed to be able to figure things out. But I'm starting to think that maybe being smart is actually making this harder. Maybe I need to learn how to not figure things out, if that makes sense." An older woman named Patricia shared after him. "I'm Patricia, and I'm an alcoholic. I was a research scientist for 30 years. I spent the first 2 years of my sobriety trying to research my way into recovery. I read every study, analyzed every approach, created elaborate treatment plans for myself. But I didn't actually get sober until I stopped trying to understand sobriety and started practicing it." David felt a familiar recognition. Patricia continued, "My sponsor told me that my intelligence was a gift, but trying to think my way into sobriety was like trying to think my way into swimming. At some point, you have to get in the water." After the meeting, David sat in his kitchen feeling calmer than he had in months. The wine rack was still there, but it felt less urgent somehow. He'd gotten through one evening without drinking and without creating a new system to manage not drinking. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, David called Robert. "How did last night go?" Robert asked, and David could hear genuine concern in his voice. "I wanted to drink. I wanted to research why AA doesn't work. I went to an online meeting instead," David said. "It felt like choosing to be confused instead of choosing to be smart." Robert laughed. "That's actually a pretty good description of early sobriety. Want to go to a meeting together tonight? I think it's time we started working on step 1. That evening, David met Robert at a different church basement. This one slightly better organized, but carrying the same atmosphere of functional imperfection. After the meeting, Robert suggested they grab coffee to talk about sponsorship. Working the steps isn't like following a blueprint, Robert explained as they settled into another coffee shop with mismatched furniture. It's more like exploration. We're going to look at step 1 together, but I'm not going to explain it to you. I'm going to help you experience it. David felt his analytical mind immediately wanting to ask for clarification, methodology, expected outcomes. Instead, he nodded and waited. Step 1 says we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable, Robert continued. I want you to write about your experiences with powerlessness. Not what you think powerlessness means, but specific times when you tried to control your drinking and couldn't. Like examples, like evidence. You're an architect, David. You understand evidence. I want you to document the evidence of your powerlessness, not your theories about it. David felt something click. This wasn't about understanding powerlessness intellectually. This was about acknowledging powerlessness factually. And the unmanageability part? Same thing. Specific examples of how your drinking made your life unmanageable. Not dramatic bottom stories, just honest inventory of how alcohol affected your daily life, your relationships, your work, your peace of mind. David thought about Maya packing her suitcases, about the hospital project rejections, about the mental energy he'd spent creating and revising drinking protocols. This sounds like homework, David said. It is homework, Robert agreed. But it's not homework designed to teach you something new. It's homework designed to help you acknowledge something you already know but haven't admitted. Walking back to his car, David felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Relief. Not the temporary relief that came from solving a problem, but the deeper relief that came from setting down a burden he'd been carrying too long. For the first time since he'd started drinking, David wasn't trying to figure out how to drink successfully. He wasn't trying to figure out how to stop drinking successfully either. He was just not drinking today and seeing what that felt like. It felt like a vacation from having to control everything. It felt like the first full breath he'd taken in a year. Maybe this was what Robert had meant about surrender being more powerful than strategy. Maybe powerlessness wasn't about admitting failure. Maybe it was about admitting that some things were bigger than his ability to manage them. Maybe letting go wasn't giving up. Maybe it was finally getting started. That night, David sat at his drafting table not to create new systems or protocols, but to write about the times his old systems had failed. For the first time in his adult life, he was documenting his limitations instead of trying to overcome them. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new. Part 8. The higher power David already had. David approached his Step 1 homework with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to structural engineering reports. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was being asked to use his analytical abilities for something constructive rather than destructive. He created 2 columns on a fresh sheet of paper: evidence of powerlessness and evidence of unmanageability. Then he began documenting, not his theories about his drinking, but the factual record of what had actually happened. Evidence of powerlessness. The Wednesday night, he'd decided to have just 1 glass with dinner and finished the entire bottle while working on the Peterson project. The client dinner where he'd planned to match the other guests' consumption, and ended up drinking twice as much as anyone else. The morning he'd found 3 empty wine bottles in his recycling bin, and couldn't remember opening the third one. Evidence of unmanageability. The 47 different drinking protocols he'd created and revised over 18 months. The spreadsheet tracking his consumption that had grown to include 17 different variables. The mental energy spent calculating optimal wine purchases, timing consumption windows, and managing the logistics of his drinking schedule. The evening he'd spent 2 hours creating an architectural blueprint for alcohol consumption, instead of working on actual architecture. As David wrote, he felt something unexpected. Excitement. Not the manic energy of creating new systems, but the satisfying engagement of finally using his analytical mind for honest assessment rather than elaborate self-deception. Robert had given him something else to read, Bill's story from the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. David had approached it with some skepticism. He wasn't particularly interested in the spiritual aspects of the program, and the book had been written in the 1930s, hardly cutting-edge thinking. But as he read about Bill Wilson's early attempts to control his drinking, David felt an uncomfortable recognition. Bill had been a successful businessman, analytical and systematic in his approach to most problems. He'd tried geographic changes, medical treatments, willpower, and various systems for managing his alcohol intake. "I had never failed at anything before," Bill had written, and David felt like he was reading his own thoughts. Bill described the increasing complexity of his attempts to control his drinking, the elaborate rules and exceptions, the mental energy spent on management rather than abstinence. He wrote about the humiliation of being unable to apply his considerable intelligence to solving what seemed like a simple problem. David set down the book and looked at his Step 1 homework. Bill's experience from 90 years ago sounded remarkably similar to his own experience with wine and spreadsheets and architectural blueprints for consumption management. Maybe this problem was more universal than he'd realized. Maybe intelligence wasn't a protection against alcoholism. Maybe it was just a different way of experiencing it. When David met with Robert the following week, he brought 5 pages of carefully documented evidence. "How did that feel?" Robert asked, reviewing David's meticulous inventory. "Honest," David said. "For the first time in months, I felt like I was analyzing something real instead of creating elaborate theories to avoid reality." Robert smiled. "Good. That's what Step 1 is supposed to do. It's not about understanding powerlessness intellectually. It's about acknowledging powerlessness factually." "So what's next?" "Step 2, Robert said, and David could hear something shift in his tone. "We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity." David felt his chest tighten. "Robert, I need to tell you something. I don't believe in God. I'm not religious. I don't go to church. I don't pray. I don't believe in supernatural intervention. If this program requires faith in God, I don't think I can do it." Robert leaned back in his chair, the same patient expression David was learning to recognize. "Do you think I go to church?" I don't know. Maybe?" "I don't," Robert said. "Haven't been to church since I was 12 years old. I don't pray to Jesus. I don't believe in biblical miracles, and I think organized religion has caused more problems than it's solved." David felt confused. But the steps talk about God. The meetings end with the Lord's Prayer. "The steps talk about God as we understood Him," Robert corrected. "And that phrase, 'as we understood Him,' is there for a reason. Your understanding of a higher power doesn't have to look like anyone else's understanding." "But I don't understand any higher power," David said. "I don't believe in anything supernatural or spiritual or divine." Robert was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "David, What controlled your drinking decisions for the past year? I did. I mean, I tried to. That's what all the systems were for. Did you control them? David thought about his homework, about the documented evidence of powerlessness. Number I didn't control them. So what did control them? David felt like he was being led somewhere he didn't want to go. I don't know. Stress, maybe. Work pressure. Relationship problems. Did stress pour wine into your glass? No, but did work pressure create your drinking protocols? No, I created those to manage. Robert leaned forward. David, what was the one thing that all of your systems were designed to serve? What was the one thing that your protocols and spreadsheets and decision trees were all organized around? David felt a chill of recognition. Alcohol. Right. Alcohol. For the past year, alcohol has been the organizing principle of your life. You've made major decisions based on when and how much you could drink. You've structured your social life around drinking opportunities. You've spent more mental energy thinking about alcohol than about your actual career. David sat with this for a moment. I never thought about it that way. Most people don't, Robert said. We think we're managing our drinking, but really our drinking's managing us. The alcohol becomes the higher power we're serving, even when we think we're controlling it. So you're saying alcohol was my higher power? I'm saying alcohol was a higher power in your life. It was more powerful than your intelligence, more powerful than your willpower, more powerful than your elaborate systems. It controlled your behavior, your priorities, your relationships, your peace of mind. If that's not a higher power, what is? David felt like a fundamental assumption about his life was being challenged. But that's a negative higher power. Exactly, Robert said. Step 2 isn't about finding God. It's about finding a higher power that's actually beneficial. It's about replacing the destructive higher power you've been serving with something that could actually help you. Like what? Like the collective wisdom of people who've solved this problem before you. Like the AA program itself. Like the group of people in those meetings who've learned to live without alcohol. Like the simple recognition that you don't have to figure this out alone. David felt something shift in his understanding. So a higher power could be other people? It could be anything that's more powerful than your individual will and more beneficial than alcohol. For some people, it's traditional religion. For others, it's nature or love or human connection or the universe, or just the recognition that there are forces in life bigger than their ability to control them. What's your higher power? David asked. Robert smiled. This, he said, gesturing around the coffee shop. This conversation. The fact that someone I'd never met 6 months ago is trusting me enough to be honest about his drinking. The fact that I get to help people the same way someone helped me. The fact that there's a solution to this problem that works whether I understand it or not. David looked around the coffee shop, at the mismatched furniture and the other conversations happening at nearby tables. So it's not about believing in something supernatural. It's about believing in something bigger than myself. Now you're getting it, Robert said. The question isn't whether you believe in God. The question is whether you believe that trying to control your drinking by yourself has been working for you. It hasn't been working, David admitted. Right. So step 2 is about opening your mind to the possibility that there might be another way. A way that doesn't depend on your intelligence or your willpower or your ability to create better systems. David felt like he was standing at the edge of a conceptual cliff. Everything in his training told him that problems were solved through individual effort, analysis, and systematic thinking. but the evidence of his own experience suggested that this particular problem required something different. "This is scary," David said. "I know it is," Robert replied. "But think about it this way. You've been trying to be your own higher power for over a year. You've been trying to control something that's more powerful than you are. How has that felt?" David thought about the exhaustion, the constant mental energy, the elaborate systems that kept failing. Exhausting. Right. Step 2 is about letting go of that exhaustion. It's about admitting that maybe you don't have to be in charge of everything. Maybe there's relief in recognizing that some things are bigger than your ability to manage them. And that's recovery. That's the beginning of recovery, Robert said. The recognition that you don't have to solve this problem alone, that there are people and principles and processes that can help you if you're willing to use them instead of trying to improve them. David felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope that came from thinking he'd found a better system, but the quieter hope that came from recognizing he might not need a system at all. "So what do I do with step 2? David asked. "You practice believing that there's a solution you don't have to invent," Robert said. "You come to meetings. You listen to people who've been where you are. You start trusting that this process works, even when you don't understand how it works." That sounds like faith. It is faith, Robert agreed. But not faith in the supernatural. Faith in the natural. Faith in the fact that people recover from alcoholism every day, and they do it by working together instead of figuring it out alone. David looked down at his step 1 homework, at the documented evidence of his powerlessness and unmanageability. For the first time, those words didn't feel like failure. They felt like the beginning of something different. Maybe admitting powerlessness wasn't about giving up. Maybe it was about finally getting the help he'd been too proud to ask for. Maybe his higher power didn't have to be God. Maybe it just had to be something more reliable than his own intelligence.